So let's just start with the first question right away. What are topics and goals of traditional philosophy of science?
I think as a field that deals with what science is or what is not, right? So normally in the classes that I teach when it comes to general philosophy of science, I like to deal into questions like, for example, how science works or what is scientific methodology, like what is so interesting about scientific methodology. I assess questions regarding why scientists or how scientists produce knowledge, right? Using a specific methods and what is so special about these methods. For example, the method of induction, the method of deduction, or just like looking at trial and error approach to science. Um, I'm very interested in this because I think there must be something about this methodology, this scientific methodology that actually give us some kind of systematic knowledge about certain things, right?
You gave some courses about feminist philosophy, and one of it was named Feminist Philosophy of Science, Sexist Scientific Communities. What do you mean by feminist philosophy of science, and how does it generally differ from the philosophy of science you just talked before about?
Yes, great. So as I explain actually this in my class, like I will start first by saying what is the feminist part of it. And the feminist part of it first, in my class, I was not interested to understand it as implying that women have a better way of thinking or like a special way of thinking, and that's the reason why they do these science in a different way. I was not interested on that. But instead, I was taking feminist as most of kind of like a subject matter, like kind of like a framework to study a certain topic, right? So, for example, feminist philosophy give us a very interesting ways in understanding what is oppression or like what it means to be a woman being oppressed as a woman, right? So giving this a little bit of framework behind it, trying to understand how can we assess, for example, different accounts and what it takes to be objective in science. Like why is it that objective is something that we should go forward, and it is okay, right? Because I do believe in objectivity in the science. But what is interesting is like, well, what is always objectivity contrast with? And it's subjectivity. And then when you start thinking, okay, but subjectivity is always, now you have objectivity and then you have subjectivity. And suddenly you have these two concepts that have a lot to do with it, what we take to be good in science. But if we start like carving up, these two things have traits, well, gender traits, right? So if you look up objectivity, is very male, what we think male traits are. And if you look at subjectivity, you have what female traits supposed to have. So then it does when you start like saying, okay, so how you assess this? And I think this is where feminist comes in, trying to give us kind of like a framework to be able to study this. Um, so, for example, in the seminar, the question, because I was talking about like sexist scientific communities, the question that we assess, and I told my students this is how we're going to be assessing mostly of all the issues here, is with this question back in our heads, which is what is the difference between accidental or coincidental harms and the harms that come about as an essential part of an unjust and oppressive system? So that was the question that I wanted my students to say, like, this, see whether it was an accidental, like accidents happen, so maybe there was not an intention behind, or was a coincidental, something that you continue seeing, and there must be a motivation in why you continue seeing them. So it was very interesting that they gather this coincidental part of it and start thinking, well, from where it comes from, or how is it that we got here, in order to see how this pattern now gives us some kind of harms, and why these harms, in this sense, like the harms that we were like talking about, like harms specifically to women or female bodies when it comes to science in scientific communities, like in, what kind of scientific communities I was talking about in the class. We start talking about just like higher education, Science, like how funding is allocated, what type of questions are the ones who people in these committees assign the money to, like what questions. Also about like the healthcare system, how the healthcare system has with time harm female bodies and still do so, and why is it, right? And also we peer review systems and this type of scientific communities, how these scientific communities show some sexist pattern, but not just say, oh yes, there's a pattern. My role as a philosopher of science is to understand why is it that pattern and how that pattern constructs bad methodologies for producing knowledge.
Why exactly do scientific communities show sexist patterns? And could you say something to epistemic authority and how gender influences it?
Yes. One of the things that I was very sure that I didn't want to specify or like have it as at the center of the class is like kind of like social epistemology, because I didn't wanted it so much to be an assessment of these issues as a effect or as a byproduct of this idea that knowledge is situated. Although I believe that some knowledge is situated, I was more interested in the general, like why is it that some people are believed more than other? That we needed to accept that at least when it comes in science, there was like a dominant knowledge or like a group of people that were seen as having the dominant knowledge or the ones that produce the most better knowledge. And because these people have this epistemic privilege, we see them as authority, and authority in the sense that is the right to exert control over others' behavior, right? So for example, you can think of a doctor. A doctor, we need to grant that a doctor that has graduated, let's say that maybe has never killed anyone, it's a good doctor. Let's think of a good doctor. We need to assess that the doctor has the ability to make judgments in the domain of medicine. And if you ask them why you are doing this, they will give you a very good reason, and even like a kind of like a causal reason of why they're doing or like what they're telling you what to do. So for example, if they tell you, oh, you came up with them and like, I have a pain, I don't know, here, and they will say, okay, take this. They will you believe on them because if you ask them, well, why do you think that my headache is gonna go away with, I don't know, aspirin? They can give you a very good and detailed reason on why that will be the case. So in that way, their epistemic authority is having an effect on you in the sense that maybe you didn't want to take an aspirin, but now you're doing, right? You're doing it. So that's the whole thing. Having this type of epistemic authority has the power to change behaviors in some people or change the beliefs on some people. So now the question for me that it was very interesting, like who is granted epistemic authority? Because it's not just about changing behavior of me taking a pill or not. When you go to the level of institutions, scientific communities, you're talking about the ways that they regulate stuff, like the case of the protocol for a heart attack. And it's not just in healthcare, it can be in anything. Like, for example, there's a big issue in teaching evaluation. Why is it that teaching evaluation still portrays female professors with descriptions of, oh, she was nice, instead of like she was smart? That is something that you will see more in male teachers, right? So it's not just like, so the epistemic authority, even from students to teachers, is different according to how they portray you, right? So if I say to you in a class, I think this is the case.
There was a very noteworthy section in your course about the ignorance of female orgasm. What happened in the scientific progress and how did sexist patterns appear?
So actually, I was very happy to see that you chose this because I approached this with a very specific framework, which is called agnotology, which is actually the field that studies the making and unmaking of ignorance. So, like we always think that philosophy of science to be kind-ish, the cousin, like one of the cousins of epistemology that has to do with knowledge. This has to do with the things that we do not know. So agnotology actually studies like what is the making and unmaking of ignorance. And I actually is very interesting because they have three different types of, they identify ignorance as three different types of ignorance, right? So you have the native state, which is when you're just born. Like you're just born, like you don't know anything, you're ignorant about all this stuff. But as you grow up, you continue to learning stuff, right? But then you have two other types of ignorance, very important, which is selective choice, which is this is the decision to focus on something means that you have chose not to focus on something else. So for example, and this is the case of the female orgasm, like it seems that when they were like trying to study pleasure and sexuality, the people who were doing it at the time decided it was a choice that they make to study male's pleasure instead of woman's pleasure. So that was a choice, right? So then the question, this is the idea. So it was a choice, and the reason why we don't know that much about female orgasm has something to do that someone has decided to be that the case. And that's the idea of then, well, is it the reason why? Because sexism? Or what was it the idea? Or what was it the reason why people choose to do that, right? And this second type of ignorance is very related to the third one, which is now which is ignorance as an active construction, in the sense that you actually ignorance is maintained and manipulated. And it seems to be that, as Nancy Tuna said, this might be also a case for the female orgasm. And the paper is very interesting, but I think the gist of it is to have this idea that the way that we have been taught about orgasm, one, it has been very limited. It's only very I think it has been recently acknowledged now that, for example, women do not have, it's not the case that all women will have or females will have an orgasm by penetration with the penis. That is also more like clitoral based, right? And that's something very new. So it's not something that maybe people knew about it, well, I don't get orgasm by penetration only if they, induce it with hand. But it was not part of the science. That's something very different, to say that there's science actually trying to give an explanation for woman's pleasure. And for example, Nancy Tuna said that there can be different reasons why. One of the reasons that she says that has to say that, well, maybe as we know, when it comes to orgasm, like men, in order to reach when they reach orgasm, they ejaculate, and that actually has a significant role when it comes to reproduction. But if we see with women, it's not actually the case that you need to have an orgasm in order to be able to get pregnant, right? So you just can be laying down there and the guy can do what his business and you can get pregnant. So a lot of people might say something like this, it seems that maybe the reason why, back in the 1500s, most of the people were like, more of the scientists were males, and that's the reason why maybe they just focus on this because, this is what they knew. And then you have, well, we see now a sex expander because women were not allowed to, go to the science, well, because we're inferior. You have all these other, problems when it comes to women's and education. Then the other one is very interesting too, because let's say that they assume that, but then they continue making it that the case, that woman's pleasure was not important, and actually was not the case, that female's pleasure was something something interesting or like unique, right? And even if it was not unique, they start, and this is when you start seeing the biases. And that's the reason why we need to look at the methodology, right? Because a lot of people then start like doing, studying primates in order to see, primates are like our very close cousins. So just to see how primates behave in order to give maybe some kind of explanation in how we evolved to be these sexual human beings, right? But very interesting, because some primate evolutionary theories, instead of focusing, you can choose on what type of primates to focus on, right? But the first type of research that they did, they focus on primates, and they actually, that's the reason why it was designed. The ignorance of the orgasm of the clitoris is designed and manipulated because they decided to focus on primates that have a closer sexual life as the one preferred by the Western values, which is woman being more more tame, like not being so like sexually aroused all the time. And also that prefer monogamy, right? So because they were looking for something like that, they find out, they study sexuality in gibbons, the primates gibbons, because they actually show this type of behavior. But then later on the 80s, someone can say, well, wait a minute, you do have other types of primates that actually are very sexual, like the bonobos, and the bonobos are actually very close to us. So for example, when they start saying like the bonobos are these other type of primates like us, that we separate sex and reproduction. We're the type of primates that we just don't have sex to reproduce. We have sex because we like it. That's it. So bonobos are like that too. So the question is like, why then you choose one primate behavior instead of the other? And that's the whole idea behind of the ignorance of woman's pleasure about the clit. It has been kind of this design and manipulated type of ignorance. And of course, in this case, it's again another type of sexist scientific community, right? Like, why do you keep it like that? What do you gain from not studying orgasms in women, right? Like, and that's the idea. So this is how I approach that topic, like looking through whether it has been it has been a type of ignorance that has been designed and manipulated, and why. So yeah, that's how we did it in class.